All right, we're on.
Okay, well, welcome back. Gavin and I are going to discuss the readings for this week, which are chapters 3 and 4 from Dawkins' book, The Blind Watchmaker. We do have a few more weeks with Dawkins. And again, just to sort of reiterate, what we're doing here is making an effort, and I think Dawkins is making an effort to make sure that we're all on the same page moving forward. As you have experienced in the first couple of chapters, Dawkins is not assuming that you have any sort of formal background in biology or in evolution. And so I think he does a nice job of helping us all get to the same spot in terms of applying evolutionary thinking to animal behavior. So today then we'll talk about chapter 3, which is accumulating small change, and then we'll discuss chapter 4, making tracks through animal space. I wanted to say quickly just a word about the Growing Up in the Universe series. You've seen to this point the first 3 lectures in the Growing Up in the Universe series. Once again, this was a series that aired on public television in England on the equivalent of PBS, BBC Channel 4, I think, which is the publicly accessible television channel. And his lectures there were once again intended to bring evolutionary biology, evolutionary thinking to a broad audience. The shtick is that it's the Christmas lectures for children. But as you've now seen, while there are children in the audience, it looks like probably middle schoolers and maybe early high schoolers, and a few elementary schoolers. There are also adults, and the lectures are intended to provide an overview to, the thinking person for evolutionary science. It's certainly not applicable only to children by any means. I mean, I've seen the series now several times, and I find it useful each time. And I hope you're appreciating, hearing from your author in a different forum, in a different format. Similar concepts and ideas, but using different examples in many cases, although there is some overlap. So this week, then, we'll ask you to see the final two parts of that 5-part series. So we'll ask you to watch parts 4 and 5. And Gavin will be posting those links today.
Yep.
But presumably, if you found the first 3, well, then you'll know precisely where to find the last 2. Okay, so now I've asked Gavin to make a couple of comments, such as he thought useful, about your posting your discussion questions and your responses to at least 2 other students' discussion questions, as well as your reaction papers. I mean, bottom line, it sounds like things are going very well, but I did want to give Gavin an opportunity to say something about those. So, Gavin, please.
Yeah, so they seem to be going extremely well so far. Everyone is, for the most part, participating, posting their questions and responding. And what you guys are doing is pretty much exactly what we're looking for. Not questions that prove that you have mastered the material or have some sort of comprehensive understanding of the material, but just that you are that you have questions and that you're engaging with it. And then the responses to those, again, don't need to definitively answer your fellow students' questions. That just, from what I've seen, which is exactly what we're looking for, it's just your thoughts, your sort of initial reactions or opinions to your fellow students' questions. That's what you guys have been doing, and that's exactly what we're looking for, so that's awesome. And then you may have noticed, you may or may not have noticed, I have jumped in on a couple people's discussion questions, and I'll try to do that a few times a week. and I try to look for opportunities to answer questions that I think help elaborate on some of the more complicated aspects. So this last week, I sort of elaborated on the analogy of the blind watchmaker in one of the discussion questions. And I'm just doing that to try and give, like, to help further increase your understanding in places where I think it's appropriate. So, yeah. And that's about it. And then also the reaction papers are going well, and I can tell from your reaction papers and your discussion questions that you guys do seem to be enjoying the video lecture material, which is good. So hopefully you'll continue to enjoy that as well.
Right, and just as a good, thank you, Kevin. And as a reminder, remember, at the end of the course, you will have a comprehensive final exam. But remember, I mean, you'll have all of your material available to you. Typically, what we've done is present you with 3 or 4 or 5, a handful of essay questions, and we'll ask you to generate long-form essays. In other words, you'll have an opportunity to demonstrate that you understand the material that is being addressed by that particular question. And we encourage you to bring in material from not just the readings, of course, the Dawkins book, and then also the Wrangham book, which we'll get to next, but certainly from the lecture series that we're watching. There will be multiple occasions where you may find it really useful to bring in some of the material that you've heard in the Growing Up in the Universe series, for example, or in the next series that we see, which is called The Genius of Charles Darwin. Or some of the, I think we're going to be showing a couple of, you'll be listening to a couple of podcasts, I believe, yes, and a couple of other briefer talks. All of this is entirely appropriate for including in your essay questions for your comprehensive final exam. And once again, I want to reiterate that for the final exam, we will encourage you to talk with each other, to interact with each other. Of course, your exam must be your own independently written exam, but we will encourage you to talk with each other, to send drafts of your exam responses, your question responses to Gavin and I, give us an opportunity to comment on them, all of which means that everyone will know, will be able to know precisely how they're going to do on the final exam before you actually turn it in. But again, that's really on you as the student. And I think I've said it before, and I'll say it again. If you're willing to do the work, we're willing to do the work. And that's what it really boils down to. Okay. Shall we launch into Chapter 3, Gavin?
Yeah, sounds good.
All right. So let me offer a couple of brief comments. So the title of this chapter then is Accumulating Small Change. Now, this is such an important concept and such a crucial idea for understanding evolution by natural selection. Change, the sorts of, complex adaptations like the human eye, for example, or the human heart, or any number of bat echolocation, they cannot poof into existence in a single fell swoop. I mean, statistically, they're extraordinarily unlikely to do so anyways, but then even if large mutational changes do occur, they're almost always lethal. Okay? They're almost always a very far cry from what was working before, which is why we don't see massive change in a very brief period of time. What we see are all but imperceptible, tiny, tiny changes compounded over vast expanses of time. These changes accumulate. Okay, so a tiny change occurs, it's retained to the extent that it's beneficial for that particular organism, okay, relative to alternative designs. That organism then has a greater likelihood of surviving and reproducing, so that tiny change is passed on to the next generation. Some other tiny change occurs that happens to be beneficial, and it's built onto that initial tiny change. And so you can get accumulated changes over time that after time give the impression of design, appear to have been designed by an engineer or a human or a god. And of course, prior to Darwin, that was the accepted explanation for apparent design. Apparent design was presumed to be actual design, designed by God. Darwin's argument basically undercut the necessity of a designer. His argument is that you can get apparent design, okay, from tiny changes that are accumulated, built one on the other over vast periods of time. And the purpose of this chapter is to help the reader, to help us appreciate the accumulation of small changes, of tiny changes, and how these can account for, at the end of a long stream of time, how these can account for the appearance of what appears to be designed. What appears to be design. And so, I don't know if you want to make any follow-up comments to any of that, Gavin.
I don't know. I find it a little difficult in this chapter because, I mean, that is a really good summarization of what this chapter is doing. And I guess it might be worth saying that there's not going to be, there isn't very much discussion of actual actual natural selection or actual animal examples in this chapter. But what Dawkins is instead doing is sort of making the case for selection, making the case for what he argues is the very simple aspect of natural selection, which is that, among the possible different random mutations, the advantageous ones, when they arise, are selected for and survive into preceding generations. And that's sort of, the title of the chapter says a lot. Accumulating small changes. And in order for those to accumulate, you need a selecting agent. And so throughout this chapter, he's using examples of different computer programs, like his biomorphs and the computer program that gradually transforms a jumbled selection of random letters into a sentence out of Shakespeare, gradually over time selecting the characters that match a future I can't remember the phrase he uses, the future ideal phrase. Yeah.
Oh yeah, right.
So yeah, I guess I just wanted to say that, this, if at any point you're reading this and it seems like it's sort of abstract, or it's getting away from natural selection, or it's getting away from animal behavior, just keep in mind that what he's doing, and he's sort of painstakingly taking you through the argument for selection and the cumulative effect that selecting can have, by not really talking about animals, just talking about selection as a sort of mechanism, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, I think so. I think that also, helps sort of, set the stage for what he's doing here. The truth is, accumulating small changes, okay, and in the process of natural selection is, it's, in some ways, it's stupidly simple. Okay, it's tiny changes that produce survival or reproductive benefits are retained. Those are passed on to the next generation and can then be further built upon by additional tiny changes. So in some sense, it's very, very simple. But in other ways, it's incredibly difficult to get your head around because, what we're looking at, what we're thinking about are typically animals, okay, that exist and typically are built of, not typically, they are built of complex adaptations. And it can sometimes be very difficult to appreciate that those complex adaptations, while they appear for all the world to have been designed, okay, by a designer, have not been designed by a designer. They have been produced as the cumulative effects of tiny changes over extraordinary periods of time. And so, I think it's, it is a, the chapter does focus, as you're mentioning, Gavin, on the concept of accumulating small changes. But it's such an important concept. It's simple, and yet it's slippery. It's slippery to appreciate that it's these very tiny changes that produce the appearance of design in actual living, breathing organisms. So with that, let me just, I very much appreciate the way he opens this chapter. And so let me just move through several sentences at the beginning here in the first. Okay, so he says, we have seen that living things are too improbable and too beautifully, quote, designed to have come into existence by chance. How then did they come into existence? Okay, well, the answer, Darwin's answer, is by gradual step-by-step transformations from simple beginnings, okay, from primordial entities sufficiently simple to have come into existence by chance. Okay. Each successive change in the gradual evolutionary process was simple enough relative to its predecessor. And that's important, relative to its predecessor, to have arisen by chance. But the whole sequence of cumulative steps constitutes anything but a chance process. Okay, when you consider the complexity of the final end product relative to the original starting point. The cumulative process is directed by non-random survival. Okay, and then he says, very straightforwardly, the purpose of this chapter is to demonstrate the power of this cumulative selection as a fundamentally non-random process. Okay, and that's where, Gavin mentioned you have the two scenarios where you have, a chimpanzee or a baby sort of whacking away at a keyboard, and how long would it take without selection to hit, the target phrase, methinks it is like a weasel. And you can see that without any selection, where you're basically starting over each time, it would essentially take forever. I mean, you basically wouldn't get there. There's too many, the target is one in a, as he says, trillion, or whatever it is. On the other hand, with very simple selection, you can get there in, something like, what does he say, 40 so-called generations, where just, I think where it's, where you instruct the computer to select the phrase, select, the bashings on the keyboard that are just a tiny bit closer. Okay, and then those are retained. Well, then it doesn't take forever. In fact, it takes something like 40, bashing generations, or whatever it is. And the point there is that with just a little bit of selection, cumulative selection, you can get apparent design. Okay, that's an example just utterly outside of animal behavior per se, but just articulating that it's just a process. It's a process of, tiny changes accumulating over time that can produce at the end of that time, at the end point, something that looks as if it were designed, even though in each generation it's randomly generated, and in each generation, what is not random is that some feature, some trait, some typing, whatever it happens to be, is a little bit better than other features, or in the case of the Shakespeare text, it's a little bit closer, and that's all you need to get huge change. Okay, let me just look at this. So he's setting up this idea, and he makes this very important distinction. I mean, it's just fundamental between what he calls single-step selection and cumulative selection. Okay, this is on page 63 and 64 and 65. He says, right, the simple sieves we have been considering so far in this chapter are all examples of single-step selection. So if you have a hole and you shake, you shake some material. You have a collection of material, and you have a hole that's only so big. Only the material that's small enough to fit through the hole will actually fit through the hole. And so above, you have material that's each particle of which is too large to have gone through the hole. And then below, you'll have material that's small enough to go through the hole. So you'll have this difference in the material above and the material below. Well, that's simple selection. Okay. Nothing is, you're not retaining any changes that have occurred over multiple generations. It's a very simple selective process, okay, producing larger stuff above and smaller stuff below. Okay, that's in stark contrast to what he calls cumulative selection. He says the essential difference between single-step selection and cumulative selection is this. He says, in single-step selection, the entities selected or sorted, pebbles or whatever they are sorted once and for all. Okay, it's over. In cumulative selection, on the other hand, they, quote, reproduce, okay, or in some other way, the results of one sieving or sieving process are fed into a subsequent sieving, okay, which is fed into another, and so on. The entities are subjected to selection or sorting over many generations in succession. The end product of one generation of selection is the starting point for the next generation of selection, and so on, for many generations. Okay? Now, is there anything further we might say, Gavin, to sort of hammer home this distinction between single step and cumulative selection?
In Climbing Mount Improbable, he makes a similar sort of distinction between finding and cumulative finding, using a sort of analogy between, if you wanted to find sharp stones, like if you wanted to scour the earth for the sharpest stones, you could do that and you would end up with a collection of sharp stones. But that would be a very different sort of selection process than finding a collection of reeds on a shore or on a bank and selecting the ones that were the most rigid and that made the best knives if you were to cut them, and then breeding those so that in the next generation you had a collection of reeds that were extremely rigid and made good shivs or knives, and then selecting the best of that generation, and then so on, and that being a cumulative finding comparison or parallel to the single step finding of selecting sharp rocks. And I thought that was also a good kind of a good way to contrast the two different types of finding, how they're not the same, and how the effects of cumulative change can compile so greatly over time.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's a great example. And towards a few more pages into this chapter, he's this is near the bottom, page 70. But he says, he's sort of trying to, he says, there's a big difference then between cumulative selection, in which each improvement, however slight, is used as a basis for future building, and single-step selection, in which each new try is a fresh one. He says, if evolutionary progress had to rely on single-step selection, it would never have gotten anywhere. If, however, there was any way in which the necessary conditions for cumulative selection could have been set up by the blind forces of nature, strange and wonderful might have been the consequences. And he says, as a matter of fact, that is exactly what happened on this planet, and we ourselves are among the most recent, if not the strangest and most wonderful, of those consequences. And then continuing on, and again, just I want to be sure we make this just razor clear. And then also he's going to introduce this issue of randomness, and I think this also is an equally important point. He says, it is amazing that you can still read calculations like my hemoglobin calculation, which he does in the previous pages, used as though they constitute arguments against Darwin's theory. The people who do this, often expert in their own field, astronomy or whatever it may be, seem sincerely to believe that Darwinism explains living organization in terms of chance, single-step selection alone. Okay? This belief that Darwinian evolution is random is not merely false, it is the exact opposite of the truth. Okay? Chance is a minor ingredient in the Darwinian recipe, but the most important ingredient is cumulative selection, which is quintessentially non-random. I mean, selection, that is taking something that has some special quality, okay, is precisely the opposite of allowing things to move randomly. Okay, so Darwinism, the fact that Darwinism works, okay, is attributable wholly to the fact of non-random selection. Okay, Darwinism is not a theory of chance. Okay, it is a theory of non-random selection. And that is a really, I mean, that's a doozy of a misunderstanding. That people say things like, well, I don't believe in Darwinism because I didn't derive by chance. I'm not just a chance occurrence. No, you're not just a chance occurrence. Nothing about you is a chance occurrence in terms of the adaptations that comprise you. Okay, the heart, the liver, the lungs, the brain, okay, and all the psychological machinery involved. Yes, it's true that there is a role for chance, and that role is the role played by the mutations that occur in the genes that build our bodies and our brains.
Right. Yeah, no, I get what you mean by saying that it's sort of a slippery understanding of,
Yeah.
the role that chance play, because it does play a role.
Yeah.
But it does seem as though it can be easy for people to overemphasize the role that it plays in natural selection.
Yeah, I was just thinking about this. So chance doesn't produce the apparent design. Chance produces the material that selection uses to generate the apparent design.
I think that's a good way to put it.
Yeah. So he goes on and he's saying, let's see. He says, although the monkey Shakespeare model is useful for explaining the distinction between single-step selection and cumulative selection, it is misleading in important ways. Okay, and this is, also crucially important to appreciate this example. He says one of these is that in each generation, a selective breeding, the mutant progeny phrases were judged according to the criterion of resemblance to a distant ideal target, namely the phrase, methinks it is like a weasel. But then Dawkins notes, life isn't like that. Evolution has no long-term goal. There is no long-distance target. Okay? There is no final perfection to serve as a criterion for selection. Okay? Although human vanity cherishes the absurd notion that our species is the final goal of evolution. In real life, the criterion for selection is always short-term. Okay? Either simple survival or more generally reproductive success. If after the eons, okay, after huge expanses of evolutionary time, what looks like progress towards some distant goal seems, with hindsight, to have been achieved, this is always an incidental consequence of many generations of short-term selection. So he says the watchmaker, that is cumulative selection, is blind to the future and has no long-term goal. That's also a point that causes many people, many smart people, to stumble. There is no goal. There is no target. Okay, everything is occurring locally. Okay, that is in the here and now. Okay, organisms aren't trying to evolve a better functioning eye. Okay, there is no agent who's manipulating life to get life to a better functioning eye. Some organisms survive better than others. Some reproduce better than others, and whatever they had, okay, that caused that greater success is passed on to the next generation. Okay? These tiny changes compounded over evolutionary time, produce what appear to have been designed traits or features, but they only appear that way. And it's only in hindsight that we can say how wonderfully and beautifully designed, apparently designed, the eye seems. And it must have been designed, okay, given that it is so well put together. But that's what you have to keep pushing back on, is this, this intuition that there must be a designer, because there is no designer.
Yeah. I wonder if it's also worth saying of this chapter that, even though Dawkins' examples with the biomorphs and the sentence selecting or character selecting program, although those do have distinct goals in mind, natural selection need not have that in order to head towards something as complex as the eye or any other, what could be explained as a complex adaptation. It only, it's totally sufficient for an environment to sort of favor organisms with certain traits over others, and then over time that reaches some sort of complex adaptation, or what we might think of as a distant endpoint, or whatever we're looking at right now, and we think, well, that's the finish line, that's the endpoint. It must have been traveling in this direction, as if it were on some sort of path or trajectory. But that's not the case, and that needn't be the case with the way that natural selection works. It selects with what it's given, and among that is the next generation of that species of organism, and so it goes until indefinitely. If that, I'm not sure if that helped or just made things more complicated, but
well, I mean, one never knows, and for some students, and for some people, hearing it in that way, I think, can be very useful and can cause something to click in a way that something I just said, doesn't. And that's really what we're doing here. What our goal is to sort of work through this material and try to come at it and summarize it from different places, with the hope that it will click for some of you in a way that maybe it didn't when you first read Dawkins. And again, I mean, if you have continued questions, and I hope many of you still do, well, that's precisely what we're asking you to include and to post to your discussion as your discussion questions, giving others a chance to respond, and perhaps and giving us an opportunity to sort of see what's where you're stumbling, or what you're getting, or where things are clicking. All of this is useful as we sort of struggle to help you to appreciate this material. Okay. So as Gavin mentioned, Dawkins uses these his biomorph program as a way to sort of illustrate the selection of, or the accumulation of small changes, producing eventually something that appears to be designed. Okay, despite the fact that there is no design. There is no design, there's no target. And he does this in a number of ways with a number of these programs. And I think, it's worth pointing out that I'm happy to be looking at figure 5, which is the endpoint of some of his toying around. Remember, he's not trying to produce these particular pictures or these particular images or these particular biomorphs, as it were. Okay, you got at the end point of this selection, and he's just selecting for what seems pretty at the time, or something to that effect. Nothing especially guided, but these are cumulative changes, and he ends up with apparent designs such as a swallowtail, something he calls a man in a hat, a lunar lander, a bat, and so on. And again, there was no effortful, conscious design in place. And yet he ended up with what appear to have been designed figures. Okay, so each one of these biomorph examples, he's trying to illustrate, some feature of the natural selection process, the accumulation of small changes compounded over time or over generations that can produce at an endpoint something that in hindsight one could say, wow, that really looks as if it were designed. But you've watched him move through this process, arriving at a bat, for example, where he never had that in mind as a goal. And I actually think it's fairly illustrative where, I think it's in this chapter where he basically arrives at a place where he has these really interesting designs and he wants to see if he can recreate them, but then he's lost the code that he used to get there. Remember, he wasn't purposely selecting. He was just letting his mind wander. And he would end up with some really interesting figures, or things that looked like really interesting figures, but he hadn't saved the code that went up to that. And he, communicates to the reader how it was all but impossible for him to get to a particular target. He had the target in his hand. He printed the target, what he wanted to get to. And for all the world, he, in the majority of cases, couldn't get there. I think he said he got close on one of the designs.
Right.
But he had no idea if it was the same process. And that's just it. Having a target in mind doesn't necessarily help you because you're dealing with changes that are so small that, you can't really say, is that closer to what I'm getting, what I want to get to, or is it not? I mean, that's how small these changes are. I don't know if you found that useful, Gavin. I found it kind of useful.
No, I agree. I think that was a helpful sort of way of, elaborating on the difficulties of the process. Like you said, even with a distant goal in mind.
Right. Yeah. Okay. So he works his way through these various biomorphs and sort of evolving these different. He's jumping around. He's searching around in what he calls biomorph land. Okay. And so on page 102, then towards the end of this chapter, he says, okay, so what is all this telling us about real evolution? Well, once again, he says, it is ramming home the importance of gradual, step-by-step change. There have been evolutionists, he says, who have denied the gradualism of this kind, that gradualism of this kind is necessary in evolution. Our biomorph calculation shows us exactly one reason why gradual step-by-step calculation change is important. When I say that you can expect evolution to jump from the insect to one of its immediate neighbors, but not to jump from the insect directly to the fox or to the scorpion, okay, what I exactly mean is the following. If genuinely random jumps really occurred, say from a chimpanzee to a human, something like that, or a dog to a cat, okay, if those kind of random jumps really occurred, then a jump from insect to scorpion would be perfectly possible. Indeed, it would be just as probable as a jump from an insect to one of its immediate neighbors, but it would also be just as probable as a jump to any other biomorph in the land. And there's the rub, he says. For the number of biomorphs in the land is 500 billion in this particular example. And if no one of them is any more probable as a destination than any other, the odds of jumping to any particular one are small enough to ignore. Okay, then he goes on to say, notice that it doesn't help us to assume that there is a powerful non-random selection pressure. It wouldn't matter if you'd been promised a king's ransom if you achieved a lucky jump to the scorpion. The odds against your doing so are still 500 billion to 1. But if instead of jumping, you walked one step at a time and were given one small coin as a reward every time you happened to take a step in the right direction, you would reach the scorpion in a very short time. Not necessarily in the fastest possible time of 30 generations in this example, but very fast nevertheless. Jumping could theoretically get you the prize faster in a single hop. But because of the astronomical odds against success, a series of small steps, each one building on the accumulated success of previous steps, is the only feasible way. All right. There's a couple more points I wanted to make at the very end here. Okay. So he says, the tone of my previous paragraphs, that one in the previous few pages, is open to a misunderstanding, okay, which I must dispel, says Dawkins. He says, it sounds once again as though evolution deals at distant targets, homing in on things like scorpions. As we have seen, it never does. But if we think of our target as anything that would improve survival chances, the argument still works. If an animal is a parent, it must be good enough to survive at least to adulthood. By definition, it is possible that a mutant child of that parent might even be better at surviving. But if a child mutates in a big way, so that it has moved a long distance away from its parent in genetic space, what are the odds of its being better than its parent? The answer is that the odds are very large. The odds against are very large indeed. Okay, and the reason is the one we have just seen with our biomorph model. If the mutational jump we are considering is a very large one, the number of possible destinations of that jump is astronomically large. And because, as we saw in chapter 1, the number of different ways of being dead is so much greater than the number of different ways of being alive, the chances are very high that a random jump in genetic space will end in death. Okay? I mean, the odds are, if to the extent that the child is dramatically different from the parent, the odds are crushingly large that that huge change will be lethal. I mean, we know the parent survived, lived long enough to reproduce. If the child is dramatically different, the odds are crushingly against an improvement in the parent design.
Right.
The odds, just given the various possibilities, the odds are strongly in favor of death, of not surviving. Okay. All right, so then he goes on to say about biomorph land, and he says, I hope that you didn't find it too abstract. There's another mathematical space filled not with 9-gened biomorphs, which is what he was working with in his example, where you were tinkering with the 9 genes to see what happened. So there's another mathematical space filled not with 9-gene biomorphs, but with flesh and blood animals made of billions of cells, each containing tens of thousands of genes. This is on nearly the last page of the chapter. He says, this is not biomorph space, but real genetic space. The actual animals that have ever lived on Earth are a tiny subset of the theoretical animals that could exist. Okay? These real animals are the products of a very small number of evolutionary trajectories through that genetic space. Okay? The vast majority of theoretical trajectories through animal space give rise to what he calls impossible monsters, things that never existed. They never existed because they couldn't exist. Okay? That is, they couldn't in reality exist. Maybe theoretically they could exist. You know, humans with 2 heads, for example. Okay, real animals are dotted around here and there among the hypothetical monsters, each perched in its own unique place in genetic hyperspace. Each real animal is surrounded by a little cluster of neighbors, most of whom have never existed, but a few of whom are its ancestors, its descendants, and its cousins. That brings us to the next chapter, chapter 4, which he calls Making Tracks Through Animal Space. And this is sort of the goal of this chapter is to bring to life this sort of genetic space, okay, and helping the reader distinguish actual organisms from theoretically possible, okay, but actually non-existent, okay, organisms. Okay, why would he do that? Well, what he's doing really is, in this chapter, is taking the reader through various portions of what he calls, well, animal space, and hammering home the notion that the animals that have existed and that do exist are a very, very tiny proportion of all possible, okay, spots out there in theoretical animal space. And the reason these animals have existed, and the reason these animals, including humans, do exist, okay, is wholly attributable to natural selection. okay, weaving its way through, okay, the vast expanse of possible space. So this is all very abstract. So we should zero in on more sort of meatier examples, I suppose. Although still there's some conceptual space that has to be cleared to get to, an appreciation for the process of natural selection. Okay, I don't know if you want to make any further opening comments here, Gavin.
Opening comments, no. I wasn't sure where exactly you wanted to spend time in this chapter, because I know at the beginning he starts out by laying out these questions, and in a lot of ways it seems very similar to his points in chapter 2 about successive versions of an adaptation. The cumulative versions of an adaptation in each successive generation being each one being advantageous to the animal that owns it, such that you can go from no eye at all to a complex human eye, and that being sort of part of the larger argument of what you were saying, that there is a sort of, it does relate, even though it might be hard to kind of make the connection to the idea that there is a very small subset of all the possible animals that that did actually exist, because there are only a small subset of designs of animal organism designs that actually work in any given environment. But also later in this chapter, not to jump ahead too much, but he starts talking about convergent evolution, where distantly related animals converge upon the same sort of design, such as the marsupial moles and the marsupial, the Tasmanian tigers, I think they are. They look like wolves, but they're more closely related to a kangaroo than a wolf because they're marsupials. And what he's saying with that is, again, part of the same argument that, natural selection converges on these similar sorts of designs in distantly related animals, because there's only, really a limited set of possible successful animal designs, even in distant geographies.
Right, there's only so many ways to make a living.
Right.
Right. That's exactly right. Right. And that constrains, in some sense, the tracks that animals make through animal space.
Yes. Yep.
So, okay, good. Yeah, no, I think that's I like the way you've linked convergent evolution with, this business of making tracks through animal space. Because again, I think that's a separate but a really important point that he's making later in this chapter. So let's back up, and he asks a few questions here right at the beginning to sort of remind the reader what the reader, has learned in the previous few chapters. So he says, as we saw in chapter 2, many people find it hard to believe that something like the eye, Paley's favorite example, so complex and well-designed, with so many interlocking working parts, could have arisen from small beginnings by a gradual series of step-by-step changes. And he says, let's return to the problem in light of such new intuitions as the biomorphs may have given us. So he says, answer the following two questions. Could the human eye have arisen directly from no eye at all, in a single step? And 2, could the human eye have arisen directly from something slightly different from itself, something that we may call X? He says, well, the answer to question 1 is clearly a decisive no. The odds against a yes answer for questions like question number 1, the eye poofing into existence in one single step. Okay, the odds against are many billions of times greater than the number of atoms in the universe. Okay, it would need a gigantic and vanishingly improbable leap across genetic hyperspace to go from no eye to a fully functioning, human-like eye. Okay, the answer to question number 2 is equally clearly yes. Okay, provided only that the difference between the modern eye and its immediate predecessor X is sufficiently small. Provided, in other words, that they are sufficiently close to one another in the space of all possible structures. Now, very importantly, he says if the answer to question 2 for any particular degree of difference is no, all we have to do is repeat the question for a smaller degree of difference. Okay, carry on doing this until we find a degree of difference sufficiently small to give us a yes answer to question number 2. Okay, so let's see. He says X is defined as something very like a human eye, sufficiently similar in that the human eye could plausibly have arisen by a single alteration in X. Okay, if you have a mental picture of X and you find it implausible that the human eye could have arisen directly from it, this simply means you've chosen the wrong X. Make your mental picture of X progressively more like a human eye until you find an X that you do find plausible as an immediate predecessor to the human eye. There has to be one for you, even if your idea of what is plausible may be more or less cautious than mine. Okay, all of this leads to question number 3. Is there a continuous series of X's connecting the modern human eye to a state with no eye at all? And he says, it seems to me clear that the answer has to be yes. Okay, it has to be, provided only that we allow ourselves a sufficiently large series of X's. Okay, so he says, given, say, 100 million X's, we should be able to construct a plausible series of tiny gradations linking a human eye to just about anything. Okay, so given enough or a sufficiently large series of tiny changes, you can get from no eye at all to the wonderful complexity of an eagle eye or a human eye. Let's see. Then he goes on to ask question 4, considering each member of the series of hypothetical X's connecting the human eye to no eye at all, is it plausible that every one of them was made available by random mutation of its predecessor? Then he goes on to say, this is really a question about embryology, not genetics, and is an entirely separate question from the one that worried the Bishop of Birmingham and others. He goes on to say, he'll return to this matter in chapter 11, but here he'll just stress again the difference between small change and large. The smaller the change you postulate, the smaller the difference between X double prime and X prime, or the X's right next to each other, then the more embryologically plausible is the mutation concerned. So he asks us to remember that however complicated the embryological status quo may be in any given generation, each mutational change in the status quo could be very small and simple, and almost certainly is very small and simple. All right. So in short, not only must a complex adaptation have emerged or evolved over evolutionary time from very simple beginnings. No, not only can a complex adaptation evolve from much simpler beginnings, but the reality is it must have, for the various reasons that Dawkins is suggesting. There's simply no biological, no genetic, and no statistical reason to expect complex adaptations to emerge in full force in one fell swoop by simple selection randomness.
Right. And these are sort of the tracks in animal space that I think he's talking about. He's sort of setting the limitations of the paths that natural selection can take, and this is just sort of one aspect of it, but in the path from no adaptation to complex adaptation, the path is small gradual steps from nothing to something, basically.
Yes, exactly. Now that logic then caused many biologists, many philosophers, and still causes many smart people today to ask questions like Stephen Jay Gould asked. Stephen Jay Gould is a was a Harvard biologist, super smart guy, but he was troubled by this process, and he asks, what good is 5% of an eye? Okay. He says, actually, we avoid, let me back up just a tiny bit. The book goes on, this particular book that Dawkins is referring to, he says the book goes on to quote Stephen Jay Gould, the noted Harvard paleontologist, as saying, we avoid the excellent question, what good is 5% of an eye? By arguing that the possessor of an incipient structure, what good is 5% of an eye? By arguing that the possessor of an incipient structure did not use it for sight. Okay, the reason I wanted to bring this up is the logic of cumulative selection has led people to ask questions like, but what good is half an eye? What good is part of an eye? Okay, you're saying that the eye evolved tiny step by tiny step. Well, what good is part of an eye? I mean, eye to be functioning with all of its parts perfectly well in order to generate sight, such as humans have, for example. Or you could ask, well, by your logic, there must have been quarter wings and half wings and three-quarter wings. Well, what good is half a wing if you need a full wing to power flight as we see it? And Dawkins's response, and in fact, Darwin's response was, well, that's simply not so. 5% of an eye may well be better than 4%. 4% better than 3%, by which he means having a slightly better, having the ability to detect direction, for example, from a tiny, by having some access to a light source, some receptivity to a light source, may be the difference between life and death, between an organism that is sensitive to light from one who isn't sensitive to light. Now, we can call that, a 1 or a 2% change, or whatever, a tiny change from being sensitive to light and not sensitive to light. That can start the process, which ultimately, and in hindsight, produces something as complex as an eye, a fully functioning, fully formed human or eagle eye.
Right.
So he goes on and he's talking about, the evolution of an eye and what good is half an eye and so forth. And he says, well, maybe we should focus instead of, on, in terms of understanding, the evolution of vision. I know. He was using the example of mimicry and how some animals are mimics of other animals in terms of their coloration. So there are some species of moth, for example, which have a coloration that is remarkably similar to other species of moth that have this particular coloration. And in these other species, it's an indication, or it's a signal of poison, basically. And it's sort of a message to would-be predators to say, don't eat me, I'm poisonous. Well, then there are other moths who have grabbed onto this and display the same coloration despite the fact that they're not poisonous. And so the question is, how does that evolve? How does complex mimicry like that evolve? I mean, how could it be that, a 1% mimic would be useful? It wouldn't seem to be useful. Well, it might be, insofar as it's better than a 0% mimic or a 5% mimic in terms of coloration and patterning could be better than a 4%. Better how? Well, instead of focusing on how close the match is, he asks us, wait a second, think in terms of the predator's vision. Okay? He says, no matter how good any one predator's vision may be under some conditions, it can be exceedingly poor under other conditions. And he goes on to say, we can easily, in fact, appreciate from our own familiar experience the whole spectrum from exceedingly poor vision to excellent vision. If I am looking directly at a stick insect 8 inches in front of my nose and in strong daylight, I shall not be fooled by it, he says. You'll know. You'll be like, Yeah, that's an insect. That's not a stick. I shall notice the long legs hugging the line of the trunk. I may spot the unnatural symmetry, which a real stick would not have. But if I, with the very same eyes and brain, am walking through a forest at dusk, I may well fail to distinguish almost any dull-colored insect from the twigs that abound everywhere. The image of the insect may pass over the edge of my retina rather than the more acute central region. The insect may be 50 yards away, and so make only a tiny image on my retina. The light may be so poor that I can hardly see anything at all anyway. In fact, it doesn't matter how remote, how poor is the resemblance of an insect to a stick. There must be some level of twilight, or some degree of distance away from the eye, or some degree of distraction of the predator's attention, such that even a very good eye will be fooled by the remote resemblance. And he concludes this, I think, very compelling argument that the important thing about light intensity, distance of insect from predator, distance of image from center of retina, and similar variables is that they are all continuous variables. Continuous, okay? They're not either or. They vary by insensible degrees all the way from the extreme of invisibility to the extreme of visibility. Such continuous variables foster continuous and gradual evolution. So that half a wing may well indeed be better than 49% of a wing. And that's all that matters in the currency of selection, of evolution by natural selection. Insofar as half a wing, enables, the organism to fall a little more softly to the ground, okay, than an organism with 49% of a wing, in which the fall is a little more taxing and, in fact, produces an injury.
Right. And I think another way he puts it in this chapter is that, in terms of mimicry being a sort of gradually evolved sort of adaptation, your mimicry doesn't necessarily have to be better than the than the predator with the best eyes. It might just have to be better than the predator with the worst eyes. So
That's right.
Just like your mimicry, may exist on a continuum, so too might the eyes of a predator. So that's just sort of another aspect of how adaptations can be or must be gradual, because there aren't fine lines between well adapted enough to avoid detection and then on the other side of the line it's just death. So there's no way that there could be intermediates between a well adapted to its environment stick insect and an insect that was not at all adapted to look or to have any sort of camouflage,
Right. So you're saying that there's likely to be intermediates.
Oh, yes. Yeah.
Exactly. That's exactly right. Which gets us to another crucial point in this chapter. This happens to be on page 119. And he says, all right, let me back up. Let us return to our question 5. Considering each member of the series of X's connecting the human eye to no eye at all, is it plausible that every one of them worked sufficiently well that it assisted the survival and reproduction of the animals concerned? We have now seen the silliness of the anti-evolutionists' assumption that the answer is an obvious no. Okay? But is the answer yes? It is less obvious, but I think that it is. He says not only is it clear that part of an eye is better than no eye at all, we also can find a plausible series of intermediates among modern animals. And that's very important. So not only might half an eye be better than no eye, or 3/4 of an eye be better than half an eye, not only might that in principle be true, but as a matter of fact, we can look at existing animals today and find the equivalent of half an eye, 3/4 of an eye, okay, and so on, and across the entire range of no eye at all to a fully functioning human or eagle eye. And that's part of what he does, is he takes you through these. There are some organisms that all they have is a light-sensitive spot. That's it. And they do very well, thank you very much, as long as they have that light-sensitive spot. Okay, there are other organisms that have a cluster of light-sensitive spots, okay, that allow for the detection of direction, for example. Okay, and that is the adaptation that they have evolved. There are other organisms that have the beginnings of what we would say are the beginnings of a lens. Okay, there's an apparent lens there, and that's what's evolved in that species, and all the way up to a fully functioning, this sort of, we're fetishizing, a human eye as if it's the pinnacle. But let's take the eagle eye or something like an octopus eye. They're differently functioning, but similar in many ways, super complex eyes. Okay, so not only might there be, functional examples. Sorry, might it not only be possible that there are these different proportions of complex eye, but as a matter of fact, they do exist, and we know they exist, and Darwin knew they existed, and he used this in his argument as well to say this isn't impossible.
Right.
In fact, it's known to be true. If you look out in the among modern animals, among currently existing animals.
Right. Yeah. No. And I think that's a good point that that people do get hung up on, sort of possibility of gradual intermediate steps all being advantageous, all being totally viable sort of adaptations for living organisms that do, like you said, very well for themselves in their environments.
That's right. And so what he does is he takes you through and he gives you some examples in eyes. He then gives you examples with a focus on lungs. Okay, you can get from 5% of a lung, if we want to put human lungs or mammalian lungs at the pinnacle. The question is, well, but could an organism function? Could it function with a quarter of a lung? Well, sure. There are animals that exist out there that evolved, their pinnacle is a quarter of a lung. And he takes you through wings and does the same thing. Okay. And here's where he does give you many examples of animals. So that this chapter is quite a bit more rich in terms of animal behavior and specific examples from across the animal world. So he's taken you through these various examples, in eyes and lungs and wings, and in the section on wings, there's a nice sentence here. He says, this happens to be on page 126, there are animals alive today that beautifully illustrate every stage in the continuum. There are frogs that glide with big webs between their toes, tree snakes with flattened bodies that catch the air, lizards with flaps along their bodies, and several different kinds of mammals that glide with membranes stretched between their limbs, showing us the kind of way bats must have got their start. So contrary to the creationist literature, not only are animals with, quote, half a wing common, so are animals with a quarter of a wing, 3/4 of a wing, and so on. The idea of a flying continuum becomes even more persuasive when we remember that very small animals tend to float gently in air, whatever their shape. The reason this is persuasive is that there is an infinitesimally graded continuum from small to large. And then he says, the idea of tiny changes accumulated over many steps is an immensely powerful idea, capable of explaining an enormous range of things that would be otherwise inexplicable. How does snake venom get its start? Many animals bite, and any animal's spit contains proteins which, if they get into a wound, may cause an allergic reaction. Even so-called non-venomous snakes can give bites that cause a painful reaction in some people. There is a continuous graded series from ordinary spit to deadly venom. Okay, and he goes on. How did ears get their start? Okay, the same story played out over and over again with regard to complex adaptations like wings, hearts, lungs, eyes, venom, ears, echolocation. Okay, this is the way that natural selection proceeds, from simple to complex. Okay. Then I like him. Dawkins brings in a quote from Darwin, and he has Darwin. He quotes Darwin from *The Origin of Species*. Darwin writes, if it could be demonstrated that any complex organ existed which could not possibly have been formed by numerous successive slight modifications, my theory would absolutely break down. Okay, the whole theory would be shot if you could demonstrate that a complex adaptation, complex organ, could not possibly have evolved gradually with tiny changes. Okay? And then Dawkins says 125 years on, now we can say 150 years on. We know a lot more about animals and plants than Darwin did, and not a single case is known to me of a complex organ that could not have been formed by numerous successive slight modifications. I do not believe that such a case will ever be found. Okay, it might be, but it's unlikely. He says if it is, it'll have to be a really complex organ. And as we'll see in later chapters, you have to be sophisticated by what you mean by slight. Okay, and if that's true, I shall cease to believe in Darwinism, says Dawkins. Okay, the point is, to a first approximation, we can presume we're not going to find it. People still look for these complex organisms that could not possibly have evolved by numerous successive slight modifications. Most famously, in the last 10 years or so, there is a biologist at Lehigh University called Michael Behe, Behe, I think, and he proposed that the tails of bacteria, the flagellar structures of bacteria that spin in a certain way to make them swim, were what he called irreducibly complex. He argued that they provided evidence. They couldn't function were they not, all the pieces of parts that made up these tails in bacterium must have existed all together, all at once, in the form in which we see them now, and could not have evolved by gradual successive modifications. And he made this argument, and he referred to this as irreducible complexity. And this was his evidence for God. God, therefore, must exist, and specifically his Christian God. Well, he was brought in as a witness, as an expert witness in a trial to assess the scientific value of special creation as a scientific theory. And he was saying, yes, it's a legitimate scientific theory because here's an example of irreducible complexity that demands a God. Okay? Unfortunately for Michael Behe, there was a litany of biologists that said, that's not right. A litany of specialists who study bacteria and their locomotion and their tail motion that documented not only could there be, gradual successive changes that led to what Behe is calling irreducible complexity, but they brought out examples in the living world of bacteria with a quarter of this fancy tail and a half of this fancy tail and 3/4 of this, and they all did very well for themselves, these bacteria. So you'd think that this would be something from deep, deep, deep in our historical past, but it is not, and it remains, a stumbling block. This notion of, I think it gets us back to the argument from personal incredulity. This argument that I just can't imagine the steps that it could take. How could a quarter of this wonderfully complex, apparently designed tail do what needs to be done? Well, it can. Okay, we know that it can because there are bacteria out there that do this. But I think it's, it pushes back on our intuitions, I suppose.
Yeah, no, I agree, and I think I sympathize with this argument a bit more than the personal incredulity, with the slight distinction that it's a little more than just, oh well, I personally can't see how this could have been, but it's sort of people taking a hard stance saying, well, there's no way this could possibly, like an intermediate version of this could possibly be advantageous to anything. So therefore, it is irreducibly complex. But still, so far, none of that has sort of borne out, and every example has been shown to have a possible intermediate that was a less complex version and that was advantageous to its owner. So
Right, and that example, just to put a pin on that, this example and what you're saying here, what we're talking about is, I thought of that when I was reading Darwin's quote. I mean, if a complex adaptation or organ, okay, could be shown, okay, if it could be shown that it was not possible to arrive at that complex organ or adaptation through successive, right, changes accumulating over time, well, as Darwin said, then his theory would be forever lost. I mean, the theory would be garbage if you could show that complexity can exist without, numerous successive slight gradations. Okay, because then the whole thing would be shot. I mean, if you can show that. This is why it is a constant draw. It's a lure mostly of creationists. Okay, they want to find something that is complex, but that cannot possibly have evolved from numerous slight gradations. The most recent of which is this, so-called irreducibly complex tail mechanism in bacteria. I mean, to Behe's credit, he was attempting to do what Darwin sort of dared.
right.
Find something that is irreducibly complex. Find something that can't be accounted for by numerous slight gradations. That is what Behe proposed, and magnificently and grotesquely shown to be wrong. And that was the case in Dover, Delaware, where the Supreme Court ruled that special creation or scientific creationism was not a theory. It was not a scientific theory, but instead it was a religious argument. And so it was not allowed alongside evolution by natural selection, which is a scientific theory and not a religious argument.
I didn't
So
know
in other words,
and that was recent.
Yeah. And that was in, I don't know, that could have been 2005.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah, I think it was in 2005. It wasn't like a super long time ago. And my guess is there will be additional such challenges. Where people are proposing something that is irreducibly complex, showing that the only way to account for it, what Behe wanted to do is document that the only way to account for this, okay, because evolution by natural selection could not, according to Behe, was by his theory of special creation. And he was careful to say, I'm not talking about, it's not necessarily a Christian God. I mean, his God is a Christian God. And he was talking, and most of this literature is steeped in Christianity. But he was careful to not say, I'm not saying it's a Christian God. It could be a Muslim God. It could be a Hindu God. They just want to bring in the notion of God. That's what they're trying to do. But at any rate, it was, they lost that case. As they have every previous case like it. Now, that's not to say, a good scholar would say, as Dawkins did, that, there may yet be such a case documented. And in which case, that would utterly undermine Darwin's theory of evolution by natural selection. So, it remains a perennial lure to creation-minded scientists. So at any rate, okay. Now the next issue he addresses in this chapter is that of convergent evolution. Now we talked a little bit about this already, and he takes you through a variety of different examples of convergent evolution, which I thought were really interesting and straight. I felt, anyways, he made a straightforward argument that what does this mean? It means that even when you're at different places in animal space, you can arrive at similar adaptations, at similar complex traits, if you're confronted as an organism with similar adaptive problems.
Right.
So let's see. So he says, this happens to be on page 145. Having set the scene, we can now look at some of the trades and convergences themselves. Okay. Again, I'm just trying to put a pin on why he's talking about convergent evolution. Okay, he's talking about. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I guess that's also sort of what I was trying to make sense of.
Yes.
In the, earlier in the discussion, and I think it's partially a way to illustrate sort of the limitations that natural selection has on it. That I guess sort of in a lot of ways this chapter complements the previous chapter, which is all sort of a theoretical explanation of the limits, the limited power of random chance, and the comparative ability for cumulative selection or cumulative change to produce complex adaptations. This chapter is more of a real life application of those sorts of concepts, explaining, not only are there limitations on the ability of random chance to go from no adaptation to complex adaptation, there are also limitations on, what sorts of designs are going to be successful, and therefore of all of the random possible ways that animals, all of the possible forms that an animal could take, there is pretty sufficient evidence that they are restrained and that they only go in a number of certain directions, and that's why he talks about the marsupials and then the resemblance of ants and termites, for example. Does that sort of make sense? Is that the impression you got?
Absolutely. I think that's exactly what he's doing here, is the way in which animals make tracks through animal space, okay, are non-random in yet another way, and that is part of the doors that are open, okay, in terms of moving through that animal space depend on, the kinds of, or the different ways in which animals can possibly make a living. And so he's showing that for example, in South America and in Australia, you have many, despite the fact that these animals, eutherian mammals and or placental mammals and what is the name for
marsupial
mammals? Yeah. Despite the fact that they are only distantly related, you see many of the same ways of living, ways of surviving evolve, because these are the tracks that are open in animal space. I mean, you could have grazers, animals that are herbivores that graze on the land, things like, cows and cattle, for example, in South America, versus in Australia, you don't have cows and cattle, but you do, well, you didn't anyways, initially, but you did have kangaroos, which are effectively the grazers that take the spot of, antelope and cow and so forth. And you don't have, in South America and in the so-called New World, you might have wolves, okay, that hunt in packs and hunt in particular on grazers. Well, in Australia, you don't have wolves, but you do have these thylacines, these basically, they're extremely closely related to kangaroos. They're marsupials, but they look for all the world like wolves. And they hunt in packs and so forth. Okay, the same way of living, okay, is open. It's one of the avenues of making a living, one of the tracks that can be traversed in animal space.
And I think for the student's sake, I think it's important to sort of explain how, how it's known that this is the trajectory that natural selection took, and that it's not, it is not the case that, there was a species of wolves and moles and shrews and, basically everything else that lived together before Australia broke off from the rest of that continent. And then, there was a subsection of, wolves and moles and shrews, etc., that then independently evolved pouches and became marsupials. It must have been that marsupials, as sort of a group, or a single group, broke off from the mainland on Australia, and among those, they all morphed into things that resemble animals on the mainland and in the New World, and that resemble placental mammal wolves and placental mammal moles. It's just that, the type of strategy that works as a wolf or as a, land predator is going to look very much the same in Australia as in the New World, and the same with the species that makes their living burrowing underground and eating insects. It's going to look very much like a mole, regardless of which continent it's on, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. And this is despite the fact that, a marsupial mole and a placental mole are only very distantly related. Okay, a marsupial mole is, in contrast, very closely related to a kangaroo. Okay, a placental mole is very closely related to a mammal, to other mammals that are in the New World that are placental mammals. They are much more closely related, despite the fact that they look very different. Right?
Right.
So very good. Yeah. Okay. So I don't know if you have anything further. I don't have anything further on making tracks through animal space. Is there anything else you want to add, Gavin?
No, I think that's it for me.
Okay, so next time then, we'll be tackling chapters 5 and 6, the power in the archives, and then chapter 6 is origins and miracles. So he addresses the issue of what a miracle is. There such a thing as a miracle? And if there is, well, what is it, given everything else that's come before? So that should be interesting and I think engaging. And again, this week we'll ask you to watch the final 2 parts of Growing Up in the Universe. That's episodes 4 and 5, and that will conclude the Growing Up in the Universe series. Okay, so, well, thank you, Gavin.
Yep. All right.
Next week.